Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Between the Trucks. Behind me, as you may recognize, is my 1965 C10 pickup truck. This is my daily driver. Got over 100,000 miles on it. Went on power tour, crossed 310, I think, all in on the truck. Not too shabby. It's the Southeast, gang, so the overheating issues are rising up. This motor I put in 10 years ago, it has always had some kind of temperature issue. Pull this thing out of a 66 Nova, didn't even do a compression check or change a single gasket. Literally pulled it out of the Nova, put it in the back of the truck, drove it home, shoved it in here after we took the other one out. First drive on this thing was straight out of state. We drove, I think, all the way to South Carolina and back, and on the way back it went up to 210 on the temperature gauge. Now I did notice that this temperature gauge, I have no recollection of where the last motor's temperature gauge was, but that is in a different spot. And it's been living at 210 for 10 years. That is what it is. But in the last couple years, it started to creep above that. So I've been able to treat those symptoms, but not like with great effect. Not permanently, not forever. So ladies and gentlemen, in this episode, I am gonna show you all the symptoms we're experiencing and all the things I'm doing to treat the symptoms of overheating. But yet, we have not found the actual problem. But hopefully, today, we will actually know the source of the problem, which I suspect may indeed be a cracked head or a blown head gasket, and how we can mitigate that without actually dealing with it. Here we go. So it is a relatively cool morning, probably around 65. It's gonna get up to 85 today. Just gonna drive it to work, about 15 miles. We'll see how she does getting hot. Yesterday she got real hot. So the one thing we've done so far before this drive is make sure that we have plenty of coolant and plenty of oil. Because if you're low on either one, it sort of skews the results, you know what I'm saying? Well, she's getting there now. 2:30 is when I know she's not doing what she's supposed to do. So it's 82 degrees out, afternoon drive, and she's already cooking. When we get to the stoplights, she just creeps up and up and up to about 230 on this gauge. I don't know what that means really, but I do think it's about 20 degrees over where it was at 210. It's early, it's raining, I gotta get to work. I'm gonna install this thing so I can put an auxiliary temperature gauge right here in line so we can see the actual coolant temperature, hopefully, in addition to the temperature coming out of the head, which is right there. Maybe it'll give us just a good idea of how hot it's really getting. All right, gang, this Frankensteinification is all hooked up. I'm gonna run it till it's warm, make sure the air is out of here when the thermostat opens, top her off, hit the road. All right, so I think I put a 195 degree thermostat in, maybe 190, I don't really remember, but when it opens, we should see it on this gauge right here. I think it's gonna open when this gauge says 210-ish, but we'll find out. Seems like that's creeping up a little bit. Looks like it opened. That's at right around 210. 190. Now we can go look down in the radiator and see if the coolant is flowing. Okay, all of that tracks according to science. All right, that's dropping down because the thermostat just opened. That's holding at 190. We're just gonna let it get warm. It is significantly cooler out here today. The rain came through, it's probably like 75. So we may have to take this in traffic to see any kind of like bizarro changes, but I believe this to be accurate coolant temperature and this to be accurate temperature of the coolant in the head. Yes, I've checked that gauge, I've pulled it out, I've stuck it in hot water with a thermometer, temperature of the water, temperature, like all of that stuff. So I've done that several times with this gauge. It's always been accurate. So let's talk thermostats. There is a prevailing loud theory on all of the forums. If you look up a car overheating and overheating problems, probably in comments on YouTube, there's a certain loud group of people that seem to believe that once the thermostat is open, On a warm day, it is just open. It never closes again. That's it as soon as it's come up to temperature. By that postulation, that would mean the thermostat's only purpose is to help the engine warm up quicker. Some of these same people say, just remove the thermostat. It helps keep the engine cool. Believe it or not, I've actually tried that back in the day on old flatheads, hopped up ones that never ran cool, always ran hot. Now, if that theory were true, once this little guy popped open at whatever rating it was, 160, 180, 185, 190, name it, right? Then if it no longer did anything on a hot day, then a properly running cooling system, by the power of some kind of unicorn fairy magic, knows what temperature to run at. So the thermostat stays open, and the radiator calls the engine and calls the coolant and says, hey guys, let's do 190. Let's do 180. Now what do you guys think? And it holds there without any assistance from a thermostat. So we're roughly 12 miles into our journey. Gauge number 1, the original gauge in the head, is showing 210. The gauge we just added just on the other side of the thermostat is showing 190. Like I said, I think I got a 190 thermostat, so that proves what I've always believed to be true and why I'm never worried about this engine, is that the heat in the head is higher than the coolant temperature going out, which means that it's absorbing the heat, moving on, and the thermostat is functioning correctly most of the time. More on that in a little bit. So this is very interesting. That's jumping up near 225. This is definitely over 190 now, but it's not, I mean, maybe it's sneaking up at the 212. Huh. So what we're talking about is about a 20-degree difference between the two, which is sort of what I always expected, but that does mean we're kind of on the verge of boiling. It's, you know, that's where things get to be problematic. Now, it is under pressure, and that does increase the boiling point, but you know what I'm saying, we're indeed overheating. Let's take the nickel tour of an engine's cooling system so we're all on the same page here, and then I'm going to tell you about my overheating issues and the things I've done to treat the symptoms but not the problem, because I haven't found the problem yet, but I may today. Full disclosure here, we're talking about pretty stock engines and pretty stock cooling systems. If you guys have 3 blowers, 6 turbos, and a red paint job on your engine, this may not apply to you. As we know, these are liquid-cooled engines. The liquid is in the radiator. It flows from the bottom up into the water pump that spins as the engine spins, gets pumped all through the block, meets a stopping point right here in the water neck, which is the thermostat. So this is a heat-activated valve that allows the coolant to pass through up to the water neck and back into the radiator. These are rated, they have a temperature right there on the bottom. But as the engine heats up, the coolant absorbs some of that heat, then getting hotter, opening the thermostat and running back up this hose into the top of the radiator, where as you drive along, the coolant flows through all the tubes in the radiator, being cooled by the air. So it is taking the engine heat, transferring it to the liquid coolant, taking the liquid coolant, bringing it into the radiator, and transferring that heat from the liquid through the radiator back into the air. Simple, right? Now, I am not an expert on this, but I do own many of these old cars and do drive them daily. In fact, I don't have a car newer than 1995, which means every cooling system I have is this style. Every day, in traffic, all over the country, this is what we drive. One of the things people get most confused about in the forums, because they insist that once the engine gets to operating temperature, this thing is open, and the numerical value of the degrees this thing is rated for to open and close doesn't matter. And that I believe to be wrong. If that were to be true, the suggestion is that as the engine heats up and the coolant heats up, it touches this thing, it opens, and from that point on, because the engine is warm, this thing just stays open and coolant flows freely. Doesn't matter if it's 30 degrees out or 100 degrees out. Doesn't matter if you're idling or if you're going 70 miles an hour with wind blowing through the radiator. And that's really just absurd, because It's not like the engine gets on the phone with the radiator and the water pump and the whole thing and says, no, we'll just keep it at 180 as soon as this thing goes wide open. It's not how it works. Now, assuming that your engine and your cooling system are working both in harmony and both in perfect operating order, this thing will gradually open and close to slow or speed up the coolant flow to keep the coolant temperature coming through this thing at whatever degree it's marked on, which means your radiator is allowing enough flow of coolant and air to cool the coolant significantly enough that when it goes back into the engine and absorbs engine heat, that by the time it gets here, it may still be under the temperature that would force this to open. At which point, the coolant flow is slowed down by this thing until it heats up, absorbing heat from the engine, and then is allowed to pass through to be once again cooled. So in this scenario, the radiator is cooling the way that it's supposed to be, meaning it's not clogged, it's allowing air through, it's allowing the coolant to flow through, all of that. And it enters the engine having been cooled. Even on a 105-degree day, you're taking about 80 degrees off of the temperature before it goes back into the engine to pick up that 80 degrees, to discard the 80 degrees, on and on and on, if we're saying 180. Now, in the case of this truck, we have a magical scenario where it works and works and works, and then one day it overheats. Once that happens, it starts to overheat more regularly. And then I go and I replace the thermostat, and the cycle begins again. There are two parts of this mystery there. One is, why would replacing the thermostat solve it? And B, why did the thermostat go bad in the first place? So if we think the radiator is good and clean and whatever, which it's pretty darn new, it's aluminum and it's clean, and the water pump is pumping water, and let's say the passages in the block aren't filled with bars leak, and the thermostat is a thermostatin, well then that would say that the cooling system is working just fine. So why did it overheat? Well, that may not be the cooling system's fault at all. That might be the engine producing too much heat. Now I'm going to list for you everything I can think of that might cause a situation where the engine is overheating, and by creating too much heat that the cooling system simply can't keep up. So jump in there in the comments if you're not already yelling at me about something, and add to this list. Number one, your timing is off. It's too advanced or too retarded. The detonation and the time of the spark hitting the gasoline may generate excess heat. Number two, guilty of this all the time. Make sure that you're not low on oil. Make sure you don't have dragging or sticking brakes, stuck caliper, e-brake stuck on, something like that. It's going to cause the engine to work a lot harder, and under conditions with a lot of heat in the day already might suddenly start creating a situation where your engine's getting hotter than it wants to get, doing all of that work for you. Look at the old carbureting machine. A lean condition where there is more air than fuel will create a hotter fire, which will create more heat and create more problems. Finally, the condition of the engine itself. If the passages are blocked and coolant can't flow, well then coolant can't flow and cool the engine off. Next, the super bad news bears of it all is if the head gasket is damaged or there is a crack in the head that allows the exhaust gas to get into the coolant, well, that's going to raise the temperature of the coolant exponentially, where the coolant is no longer going to be pulling heat from the engine, but really just from the exhaust gas, at which point the coolant will heat at a rate that it can't really be cooled by a good functioning working cooling system, because that is not what it was designed to do. So that takes us back to this. Because if you have one of those engine problems that heats your coolant to a point that even a good functioning cooling system cannot effectively cool the engine anymore, it may overheat. I cannot prove this, but I believe this to be true, that once this goes through a serious overheating cycle, because it is a series of temper sensitive springs and waxes and pistons and all of that, it no longer functions properly. It's either slow to close or doesn't open as far as it should, or doesn't close as far as it should. Basically, they don't really continue to work after you have cooked them. So after it happens the first time, the problem will continue to happen more frequently until you replace this. For you Holley guys, I think of these things like power valves on a Holley. One pop through the carburetor while you're tuning, you need a new power valve. You've just blown that diaphragm, and no matter how much tuning you do, it will never be right because an integral piece of the system is no longer functioning. You will see over the years I have cobbled together a ton of things to mitigate these symptoms. We have an oversized aluminum radiator. This is for the V8. We have the original shroud poked on the back. We've got the mechanical fan. I've got a switched electric fan in there. All of these things to treat the symptoms, but I've never really figured out exactly why this thing overheats, when it overheats, and I'm hoping to solve that today. Now, this cycle, I believe, may have been caused by low oil. I drove it on the first 85-degree day in traffic over a quart low. Now, yell at me all you want. I've done that 100 times on this engine, but that's what I'm pointing to as the cause. However, despite that fact, I am very suspicious of the head or head gasket on this engine, and that it may or may not be leaking exhaust gas into the coolant. And what I have been doing is mitigating the symptoms of that for years, potentially. Before we test it, over the years, I have done compression checks and all of that stuff. Some of that stuff's even on the channel if you're really curious. The engine tests out healthy. Does that mean that it doesn't have a cracked head or head gasket allowing a little exhaust gas into the coolant? No. So I just learned about these things. What we have here is a combustion leak tester designed specifically to tell us if combustion is leaking into the coolant, which is exactly what we need to know today. Pop that guy off. I do need to drain the coolant a little bit. It says 3 inches below the top to make this work so you don't pull coolant into your doodle device. So I'm stepping away because of the engine noise, but the idea is you want to pop the radiator cap and then run it because you're trying to see when the coolant is flowing through the thermostat. So you're trying to get it that warm because it's unlikely that, you know, a truck that sat overnight, the exhaust gases didn't find their way out if they were in there. In this case, once it's heated up and the thermostat opens, the coolant straight from the engine is going through the radiator. That should be a more conclusive test. Now, if you've watched the channel before, you know every time I open the cooling system to change anything, I run it like this anyway because that gets the air bubbles out of the system, which can be one more cause of overheating. Here we go. Sure. All right, you can see a little vapor coming through. The thermostat just opened, so the coolant here is coming through the engine. Can't really see it moving, but let's give this a whirl. I'm not even drawing anything through it. I don't think that's supposed to happen. I am indeed surprised, actually. I thought for sure this was going to turn yellow. And in the videos I've seen, there is no question whether it's yellow or not. This is decidedly still blue, which means we don't likely have a cracked head or head gasket that's allowing exhaust gas into the radiator, as I suspected. Now, maybe it got hot because I ran it low on oil. There's no question that I did that, so everything's still running well, it seems. I want to let this cool down. I got to replace the thermostat because it is now getting hotter more regularly. So I think the thermostat's not functioning as well as it should, but I do believe that is because I overheated it through some other means previously. I still can't really believe that. But it's good news, I think. I think it's good news. The journey on this overheating C10 continues. I've got a tub under here. We're gonna pull the thermostat out. There is a petcock on the bottom of the radiator, but I'm gonna go ahead and use a heater hose if it'll come off, because I can control that a little better. There we go. Even from up here, you can see how green that coolant is. That went in at Power Tour last year. I had something in like a 165 or something from the Power Tour. Not 100% sure, I don't remember, to have to watch that video. But it was not allowing the engine to get warm enough to run the heat in the winter, so I swapped it out for a 195, which allowed some, you know, pretty warm heat. But then, as it got hotter and hotter, it was maintaining temperature until the day that it didn't. All right, so here's a 180. We're gonna put this in today, but we are gonna test this one. Despite just how green this is and how clean looking it is, we're gonna go ahead and backflow the system. I'm basically gonna shove a garden hose right down there and just rush everything out the other way. The coolant flows the opposite direction, so maybe we'll see if something crazy rusty comes out. I'm still not sure what's causing the issue. I mean, that is coming out super clean. Don't know what I expected, but it would have been nice if chunks came out, because then I would understand that, like, maybe the block's corroding or it's had bars leak or something in there. All right, gang, you gotta scrape these things real clean, but I will show you. On all my old cars, I put RTV because this is all just pitted, and it may not need it on a newer car or in like some instruction manual, but when your water neck is all old and pitted, you kind of want it to not leak. So RTV is the way to go. I use plenty. All right, so I prefer to let that set up for a while. So let's go test this other thermostat. All right, so we're coming off a rolling boil here. And that thing is still not opening. Like, not even a little. That could be a problem. Not doing nothing. All right, guys, I tried 3 different times with this and I could not make it move. It is my understanding that these things are still full of wax, right? So it's almost like if it overheats, the wax loses its temperature sensitivity. Yeah, so this was definitely part of the extended problem, but something made it overheat the first time. And if we don't track that down, then we're gonna keep eating thermostats. At least that's my assessment up to now. If you're thinking of something I'm not, put it in the comments. Hoses are back in, so we're gonna refill our radiator. That's good. We're gonna go ahead and fire it up here in a second, get it hot, let the thermostat open, and once it does, we'll make sure that all the air bubbles get out, and then we will close it off. Before we do that though, let's go ahead and check the oil though. Looking pretty good. All right, gang, we got the timing light all hooked up. The vacuum advance is clamped off with a vice grip, connected to number 1, connected to the juice. Cables run around the fan. Lost many a good timing light to that, gang. Not even kidding you. All right, we're gonna fire it up. While it warms up, we're gonna check the timing, and then we'll see, make sure that all the bubbles get out of here. And then we'll shrug our shoulders, figure out what else it could be. All right. So that's showing me the coolant temperature past the thermostat is right at 190. That's usually 20 degrees over where we are right before the thermostat, so that looks like it's, you know, in the ballpark of 180, which is where we should be. So I'm a little confused here. I've not found a smoking gun that's making this thing smoke. So I suppose I could, because it tends to creep up at idle after it's been running for a while, especially if it's been on the highway. That does suggest airflow. That does suggest coolant flow through the water pump, but I don't think that's it yet. This thing is at 10 degrees advanced, initial. So that's a Rochester monojet. per my research, there are no less than 682,000 of these, all different, slightly. Also, while we're out here, I brought the vacuum gauge. Let's mess with the timing. Like when I set a small block, I usually do it by a vacuum gauge as my starting point and kind of work from there. And I don't really have overheating problems with those. Not saying that that will solve my problem here, but we got to experiment, don't we? All right, got the distributor preemptively loosened up, got my glove. I've been shocked too many times. Look, I know that means something's malfunctioning probably, but when it malfunctions, I don't want to get shocked. So, vacuum gauge, let's find out what it likes. That's way more advanced. 17 inches or so. I'm just confirming my suspicions about these other ports. Nothing? Nothing? Alright, that's ported. Alright. So what that means is the vacuum advance on the distributor was hooked up to ported vacuum. Now, just for funsies, we've got it hooked up to manifold vacuum, and we have gone ahead and dropped it initial timing down to like 6 degrees, and this seems to add 10 degrees. So, while I am hesitant to do this, because my thought would be then we're idling not at 10 where I had it set, we're going to be idling around 16 degrees advanced. More advanced, in my mind, should create more overheating problems, in theory. But for experiment's sake, I'm willing to sacrifice a thermostat to figure out if that actually is true or if that changes anything. Because at this point, all we've done is check our systems. We have changed the thermostat back to one that works at 180, and that's it. We didn't really get anything in the coolant flush. We didn't get anything in the test where we looked for compression gases. Worst thing that happens is it overheats, I guess. It's already doing that, so let's see if it behaves different, right? Right. I understand that ported and manifold vacuum is like one of the hottest arguments on the internet when it comes to like old car stuff. I don't think there's a set way for anything. I understand what both of them do under certain circumstances. What I don't understand is exactly why I'm overheating under certain circumstances. So I'm gonna change this up. What I have now is essentially 6 degrees advanced timing, and then with the vacuum, it turns into 16 total. So I guess I'm getting 10 degrees out of the canister. That feels like working in the wrong direction, but what do I know? I mean, we'll find out pretty quick. It's June in Atlanta. All right, so it's been idling for like 10 minutes, just sitting here in about 80-degree heat, and we're still doing pretty good. Both gauges are reading, again, that one reads 20 over what the real temperature is, so it's holding steady, so that's good news. I guess we'll go drive it and see how the response is. All right, the big response should be off idle, so here we go. Better. Maybe I just want to believe that. I'm not really sure. So far, so good. We drove it around. Off idle performance was great. It was very happy with that initial timing, and it didn't bog down when I hit the gas. It's not fast. It's still a slow old truck, but it's been idling for about 10 minutes or so since I got back from the drive, and it is slowly creeping up for sure. I mean, it's not bad yet, but it's not what I want to see really. So I'm gonna try and experiment while it's already hot. I'm gonna shut it down. It also started fine. I'm gonna go ahead and switch the vacuum lines. Because it's already hot, I'm gonna go ahead and switch the advance back to ported. That means essentially the timing at idle is gonna drop instantly by almost 10 degrees. I'm gonna fire it back up and see if it stays cooler. I may cheat with a little bit and put the auxiliary fan on and like bring it down a little bit and then see what happens. Let it idle for another 10 minutes. See if there's a change or not. Same situation, gang. We're right back at it. add the additional airflow. I'll see you in 5 minutes, see what that does. Hear it kick on? I did. Watch this. Well, I'm stumped. I still have the same problem. It's a manageable problem, right? The electric fan, definitely, the electric fan helps the situation. Revving the motor up and moving some more coolant helps the situation. In theory, I guess I could try to get a smaller diameter water pump pulley so it's moving more coolant more often. But let's recap what I've done in case I'm missing something, fellas. We'll work kind of backwards. So we check the timing. Right now, the way the vacuum advance is set up, it's into a ported vacuum source, so our initial is 6 degrees. We tried the same thing but different with manifold vacuum, and the timing at idle was 16 degrees-ish. No real change. We know that from what we just did in the driveway. Cooling system-wise, we have a V8 radiator, the original shroud. We have an electric fan in there as well that was added after the radiator didn't do it. The original inline 6 radiator did the exact same thing. No change whatsoever. In the heater circuit, I went ahead and added a valve to turn off the heater bypass. I've tried it both ways, no real difference. My thought, the logic here was, what if the water pump is pulling hot coolant from below the thermostat, cycling it and sending it right back into the water pump, heating the block more because the heater is not on in the summer. Thought that was pretty clever. No real change though. We've changed the thermostat, which we did have a faulty thermostat, but yet I don't think that thermostat was the problem. I think the thermostat got destroyed by some other problem. And then last, we flushed the block. I mean, kind of, just with a garden hose, not a lot of chemistry, but really nothing came out but clean water. So it wasn't even like we got rust. So, what am I missing, gang? This one is the only one that does it. And this one does it only since I've had this motor, which is like 10 years. But it's specific, and that's why I was sure that we were gonna find combustion gas in the coolant. But the test was pretty clear. It didn't happen. That mechanical fan V8. Maintains temperature. This thing also mechanical fan V8. Two different engines, same setup, perform equally well. The first engine, even with all the blow-by and stuff, drove through needles at 119 degrees and didn't have an issue. Mechanical fan, gang. Mechanical fan. This thing, we know the radiator's on the outs. Mechanical fan, inline 6. Still maintains temperature. The 54 that's not here at the moment, also, mechanical fan 283 maintains temperature. And last but not least, gang, I threw a water pump at it some years ago, and I got the exact same performance out of that too. So, unless the timing isn't what I think it is, which has definitely happened, so that's a possibility, or it's somehow running extremely lean, which it doesn't smell like it is, then I don't really know. I don't know where to look. I really don't. I think I've checked all the boxes, right? There's nothing that I'm aware of about this engine that isn't stock. And I am running 2 temperature gauges, right? I've got one in the head. That gauge always read at 210, always. Since I put this motor in. To confirm that that was not really an overheating situation, I put one past the thermostat. And that one's reading about 20 degrees cooler consistently. So, but once it starts creeping up past 210, then we get into like potential problem area. It's not like blowing the top off. It's not really boiling, but at the same time, there's a lot more wandering than I have on any other vehicle that I own, and therefore it gets a little bit more scrutiny. And then last piece of the puzzle, this is my bona fide daily. It is insured by legit regular car insurance, not by Haggerty or Grundy or Classic Car Insurance, because I literally drive this thing every day. So I've got over 100,000 miles over 10 years on this engine, and it's had overheating issues for the last, you know, I don't know, pretty much all of it, I think. It's never let me down. But if you're like me and you're chasing down an overheating problem on a relatively stock motor, I really hope you have more success in one of the steps that I've taken. Like, I just can't find it. So good luck on your projects out there. If you have a thought, leave it in the comments, please. And we will see you next time on Between the Sharks. Oh yeah, while you're here, consider subscribing. It's this button. It really helps me out, and it's totally free. Won't call you at dinner. All right, we'll see you next time. Good luck on your projects.